Well, there was a reason why I asked for being the host of this last final session, because the idea was to engage Lebohang and Rutger into a joint discussion, and very unfortunately now logistics don't allow it. That's why I announce already now that Lebohang will leave us after the Q&A section, after her keynote, which I'm very happy that she's still able to give after her fantastic appearance at the roundtable, where most of you were present and applauded her most loudly. Thank you again. So we will do two sessions, one after the other, and we start with Lebohang Liepollo Pheko. I learned to pronounce the name correctly. A feminist political economist and scholar activist, born in Zambia, of Sotho heritage, via 15 winters in the UK, today living in South Africa. She's a senior research fellow of the Trade Collective and an ambassador colleague of mine of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and since 1 month also a member of the Club of Rome. Your research focuses on international trade, heterodox economics, and political sociology, and always from a decolonial and intersectional lens. Finally, I mentioned some of your hobbies, amongst which figure walking and talking, but also the pursuit of stillness. But now I explicitly invite you to talk to us, and we are very curious to learn from your wisdom.
Thank you.
Please have the stage.
Thank you. So you'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to stand here and preach, so I shall move strategically. You'll also be not so relieved to know that I'm a legendary technophobe, so let's see how this all goes. I'm relieved that my presentation is up. I hope that everybody has been well caffeinated since lunchtime, and well glutenized as well since lunchtime. The theme of this keynote is really to share what I call understanding global economics, power relations, and real distributional power in a multipolar world. And I'm hoping that by the end of my 25 to 30 minutes, we will have been able to see and to get a picture of what this real world looks like. And when we speak about change, changing from what to what, who needs to change and why we need to change, what we're developing towards. And I remember the question that was asked of me the other evening of what is development? And perhaps today we have something that approaches more of a response. I realize that I actually still do need my glasses. So this is the outline. It's a brave new world. What is the majority world? And I think the majority world, the minority world versus the global south and the global north, and there's a reason for this binary categorization, as it were. Rethinking and reimagining international development, whatever development may or may not mean to us. And what does this mean in terms of the practice and the philosophy of development? What is economy as a rationale, as a relational, redistributive, intergenerational, regenerating, and I would argue a feminist framework, because feminist economics has given well-being economics, post-growth economics, development economics, heterodox economics, and all of the other economies which have a surname, has given it so much language and meaning. And then next to talk about a bit around redistributing power, redistributing political power, institutional power, and material power as well, and resources on this earth of ours. I've got a couple of suggestions and historical references around the modalities of redistribution, like the new international economic order, the Banco de Sur. Some of them exist, some of them no longer exist. Some of them are not actually really that alternative, but I think amongst the worst, they could be the best. And then are there any opt-out clauses as well? Is it ever feasible to repudiate the IKEA neoliberal arrangements? Because let us be honest, neoliberalism, globalization, capitalism, whatever we're calling it this week, it remains a pernicious and an extremely pervasive value system, global system. I call it the system of minority rule, made by people who we don't typically see, perhaps the ones they come out to play at Davos and in Brussels and in New York and in Geneva, but in terms of their global influence, they definitely seem to exercise huge influence, overwhelming and democratic influence over the global majority and over most of us, with or without our consent. Are we still together? Yes. Say that again. Are we still together? Yes. Yay. Give me an A, give me a B, yay. So let's reimagine development, practice, and philosophy. So one of my favorite sociologists, Stuart Hall, who was a Caribbean British scholar that many of us might have been very aware of, he really talks about this idea of the West, and he questions the West as the axis of all knowledge. He speaks around he challenges it as an intellectual enterprise. He also challenges the notion of the gaze, the white gaze, the idea that it's a mono gaze, that it's looking out at the rest of the world, the black and brown world, and this notion of the center and the periphery, when in fact, as we proceed during this presentation, we will see that in a multipolar world, we can't talk about us and them and the rest and the West. It's just not practical anymore. This perspective then allows us to understand the West as a historical unit, and a political unit, a unit of power, a unit of context, a unit that has taken its meaning and derives its whole existence from the historical adventures that begin around the 14th and the 15th century, the different colonial and imperial adventures, and the whole idea of Western adventurism and how it continues to play itself out in 2024. This, of course, has enlisted a few allies like Japan, who have a different history of imperialism. But of course, they too have also been since 1945, were an overwhelming global power. And interesting, we speak less now about Japan, and we speak more about China and to some extent India, and it begs the question of whether Japan has suddenly just dropped off the map, when in fact they still do have one of the strongest economies in the world. This other thing that I would like us to talk about very briefly is the sort of logic that informs development practice, development speak, international development orthodoxy, as I would like to call it, or the international development complex. And this, of course, is really linked into a search and rescue approach, the need to help approach, which is steeped in a Huguenot missionary search and rescue type of approach. This approach assumes that the world out there, which is the non-white world, is a barren space. And this is, of course, going back about 150 years when Google and Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp were not a thing. So what was known and unknown were far less easy and accessible. But this kind of voyaging type of attitude, and this kind of predicates this adventurism yet again, is what still seems to underpin the logic of a lot of what is called international development. It's also to do with the power to frame discourses, the ability to control outcomes, and this is often in isolation of concrete conditions, the conditions of the host country. It's also in isolation of whether or not the host country, the host community, share the aspirations of the searchers and the rescuers. This need to help model is also closely linked with a very problematic deficit model, the empty vessel model. So again, the need to help search and rescue approaches suggest that the person who's being rescued, in fact, needs to be rescued and needs help. And I mean, I often use the fish and the fishing rod example that most of us have heard. Teach somebody to fish, and tomorrow they are going to, be able to fish for themselves. And there's so many things wrong with that illustration. demonstration. The first I would like to offer is, does the person actually like fish? Let's just start there. They could very well be vegan, they could very well prefer pork, they could prefer chicken, they could prefer any number of things. So, let's start there. They might have a shellfish intolerance, allergy. You're giving them fish, you might be killing them, right? The second piece is, they also say, teach this man to fish, bloody, bloody, blah. Who does this water belong to? Has anybody asked about this? So the means of production, the means of consumption, who does this water belong to? So you're coming as an outsider and saying, we'll teach you to fish in whose water? And again, this is part of this search and rescue need to help model, which doesn't derive its intent from the actual community. Are we still together? Yes. Good. I hope I haven't made anybody, re-hungered anybody by mentioning fish and pork and goat stew and all of these things just after lunch. The other thing, the other piece of this, of course, is that it assumes that, that the person who is there has an interest in fishing. They may have other interests. They might want to cultivate from the soil. They might want to cultivate other forms of livestock. And as I said before, they might be vegan, so they might be more interested in tending to orchards. So again, this imposition of a particular prescriptive way, a particular prescription, which is in isolation of a conversation, of a dialectic or dialogue, a dialogue with the host community. And the last part of this, of course, is because, teach the man to fish. And yet statistics after statistics tells us that it is in fact women, particularly in the majority world, who do the majority of basic agrarian food production. So in all levels, this teaching the man to fish thing, yeah, let's just put that to bed. So the next part is then, this then links to pieces of the whole idea of who is an ally. I think we've all understood and well heard this, but like many of the things, the words, the constructs, the terms that come in and out of vogue, again, allyhood has become contaminated. So what is an ally and who is an ally? I'm actually going to ask anybody, what is an ally? It's not a rhetorical question, work with me. Who is an ally? What is an ally? Friend, what else?
Somebody you work with.
Collaborator, somebody you work with.
Somebody to bond with.
Somebody to bond with. Support. How do we build allyhood? How do we choose our friends? Let's just start there. Trust. Sharing who we are. Common interests. Common enemy, I like you. Yeah. So this whole idea of allyhood has in many respects become co-opted because, now we're talking the language of who is a good ally and who is a not so good ally. And this, of course, became much more prevalent in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, where many allies were putting little black boxes in their Twitter account or on their WhatsApp to show that they are in solidarity with black struggles. And yet putting a black box, are you really a friend? Is that costing anything? Are you an ally if it costs nothing? Are you an ally if it doesn't inconvenience your lifestyle in any way? And I was very disappointed in my team, Liverpool. Just for the record, I will never walk alone. Who took the knee at the beginning of the game. Now, a very good gesture, but I just thought, okay, you've taken the knee, and then what? I'm not saying they shouldn't, but as a show of allyship, I think that we should also be mindful the performativeness of it, and how this sometimes links with, on a macro level, the way in which development can also become a show of support, a show of friendship, but friendship and allyhood on whose terms. And I think Paul Farmer, who was a very good colleague of ours, may he rest in peace, who spoke about this a lot in his work in Haiti, and accompaniment, what it means to walk with a community. That cannot happen in 2 to 3 years. And you cannot log frame that into a 3 to 5 year project. It is oftentimes a long-term game, a long long-term game of trying to see measure the losses and the gains, and understand that the losses and the gains, especially the gains, will often be undramatic, inconspicuous, and difficult to quantify. And so this kind of development voyeurism is actually the antithesis of ground-up transformation. Is your friend when they just peep in, they see that you're broken and bruised from head to toe, and they give you a cup of tea and a tissue, and they take a picture of themselves giving you a cup of tea and a tissue, and then they leave, in fact. Yeah? So then this whole notion of rootedness means more than a visitor, because our friends are our friends because they are in our lives. They are our friends because they call us, they see us, they notice when something is wrong. Yeah? So this whole idea then, of course, it also speaks to the notion of deeper fellowship as a word that some people are now starting to use as well. With the communities being served, what does it mean to be in community with as well? Changing the vocabulary is not the end point, and it would be simplistic to think that just changing a word would then shift global development efforts, but it does begin in terms of changing institutional mentality. So the redistribution of power, when we think about global markets, I think that I wanted to give that framing because in many instances, the very attitudes and the pathologies, if that's the correct word, of development speak in general, are replicated in global governance. They're replicated in global economic governance. They're replicated at the WTO, the World Bank, and they're also replicated in neoliberalism. Which is why you can have people like Milton Friedman and others saying things like neoliberalism is going to hurt, but it has to. Why must it hurt? You know, it's the same attitude of take your medicine, it's good for you. It's very paternalistic, very infantilizing, and there's been no conversation and no discussion about whether or not this is the medicine that the majority world actually wants. And this kind of concept of the market within neoliberalism, I argue, is actually a very aggressive form of globalism. Globalism in its most toxic form. Globalism which has centered power amongst a few nations, the minority world, as I keep on saying. And it also relies on the kind of hierarchies, the people who keep telling you that you need fish that you don't take even though you're a vegan, and that are actually shielded from democratic decision-making processes. So if we're thinking about a multipolar world, we also have to rethink these institutions and also rethink what democracy actually means, by the way. The new international economic order was originally a revolutionary initiative, and actually it takes a lot of its impetus. I suppose there's a lot of its history, its DNA is from the Bandung project that most of us are quite aware of, and the notion that there are many worlds, pluriverses, many ways of being, and the original construction, as we know, of the third world was constructed there. There was the East, there was the West, and then this third way of being, and not third way like Tony Blair, but a proper third way. So in terms of this kind of third waveism or third worldism, it was positioning the majority world in a space of anti-colonial sovereignty. And sovereignty, when we talk about the multipolar world, is incredibly important because sovereignty suggests that each sovereign state is sovereign over itself, that there are no hierarchies. So you don't have a big bad America deciding for everybody what is and is not justice. You don't have a big bad United Kingdom deciding that everybody, in fact, I mean, the fact that we're all speaking English is testimony to the pervasiveness of UK and British imperialism, right? But that you strive for inclusion in a global system that sometimes doesn't actually want to change. And in fact, the whole notion of Brexit, the election and possible, God forbid, re-election of Donald Trump, the kind of the rise of authoritarian populism, I was happy to see that at least in India, it looks like Modi has not got an outright majority. We'll see what that means for Indian democracy, for the power shifts there. And the idea that national isolation as the answer is really one of the things that has come out of the toxicity of neoliberal globalization. Things like Brexit, the idea of exiting a multipolar community, to me and to the rest of, to many people in the majority world, just seems completely, it just seems so anti-logical. Like, why would you not want to be part of a group? Why would you not want to aggregate your power? Why would you not want to be friends with your friends anymore? And it of course begs the question, were these guys ever friends? And then this speaks to the notion of, I think, political interests, common enemies, common friends, but common interests. And these interests can shift over time. What does distribution materially mean? You'll have a look at that diagram there. But I think the one is that, of course, there's an argument that providing aid is some kind of compensation for former colonies, for the actions of former colonial powers. And of course, this is really quite problematic because it can easily delve into the area of, philanthropy, saviorism, yet again. And I often see on Twitter and in many of the debates online and, in many of, publications, which I won't mention, but which really ought to know better, this idea of how long is Africa the country, of course, how long is Africa going to take to catch up? When are they going to grow up? Well, you tell us, 350 years of oppression later, you tell us. What it means when you are in a donor, even the word donor, it's a donation, it's an act of largesse. It goes back to this nice thing to do idea. Search and rescue. We're here to help in an ahistoric context, without the context of extraction, which is why I have put that diagram out there, because statistics after statistics shows that there is far more that is taken out of the African continent than what aid brings in, whether through double financing, illicit financial flows, and just toxic corporate relations, just the endemic tax evasion. So this whole idea is again, of foreign direct investment, not so much and not so true. Trickle down is just not trickling. And now, reparations, again, should be, as a means of redistribution materially, cannot, of course, only be financial. And I'll say a bit more about educational and cognitive and epistemic reparation as well. And I'll leave you to read the rest of that there. But what about by approach? And this is something I prepared for another aid organization, and I think that it's quite a useful approach. It's worth noting, of course, that the way that development is taught is predominantly by Western institutions. My good friends at The Hague up the road, or a few train rides away, and my good friends at University of Sussex and Manchester, and so on, and at SOAS, my alma mater. But be that as it may, spot the problem. All of them have a particular geography, human geography, political geography, and physical geography representing a particular worldview. I would love the situation where my University of South Africa, for example, is also viewed as a global platform for global development, not just a place where you can study about Africa as well. So this idea, of course, of the concept of Africa experts, and I was sharing with a colleague at lunchtime how earlier on in my career, I was hiring people, interns. I was tasked with hiring interns, and of course the first thing that I was told post-1994 South Africa was, well, why don't you get some Canadian interns? I was like, okay, this is South Africa, there's Canada. Why is this a good idea? For what reason? And that was, of course, because at the time there was a bilateral agreement between Canada and South Africa, and we were getting not only literally warm bodies, like armies and armies of 21-year-old Canadian graduates, but we were also getting the aid, we were getting the approaches to development, we were getting consultants that we didn't ask for, and all sorts of other quite annoying, meat in the teeth type of foibles that we were having to deal with, yeah? So the first point I'd like to make is the point of distraction. So this refers to the location where the negative outcomes are being observed, usually in communities that are peripheralized, usually called the global south or the majority world, and these communities, these are the kinds of recipients. Secondly is the point of consumption, and I call that the point of destruction because this is where local knowledge systems, self-esteem, local epistemologies, and sovereignties are indeed destroyed and displaced by this white gaze. Secondly is the point of consumption, where ideas are then delivered to consumers, including clients, including voters, shoppers, grant recipients, project partners, governments, international institutions, and communities in the majority world, where you now have a situation where the kind of MTEF, the medium-term expenditure budgeting and framing that we would do in South Africa looks exactly the same as they do it at Downing Street. It looks exactly the same, probably more similar to what would be done here in the Netherlands than anything that we ourselves have generated and have context for. Are you giving me that look? Okay.
5 more minutes.
Thank you. So the point of decision is the place where plans are created and where the power also happens. So who makes the decisions? There are many points across this value chain of power where who shapes these decisions, who communicates with them, and all of these things often lie within development cooperation. You can add lie within funders, donors, and so forth. It also refers to the consequences that are faced by those who resist. And this is quite key, I think, particularly by the recipients themselves. So this concept of decision makers being acknowledged as the knowers assumes that knowledge and decision making from the north is dominant and cannot be challenged. And that if it is, of course, there might be consequences. Your funding might be cut, your project might be pulled, or you just might never, your friends will suddenly no longer be your friends, basically, your allies. The point of assumption refers to the location and the individuals who are responsible for the development of these norms, as well as the reasons for their establishment. It raises questions about whether these norms can be questioned, challenged, whether the minority world is able and willing to create bubbles and vortexes and spaces to question these assumptions. Additionally, it explores how these assumptions are perceived by those of us who are not part of the group. Other ideas related to global balance and power sharing, such as inclusive participation, and I think the workshop that we were part of this morning with Jose Carlo and others was incredibly instructive in trying to unpack some of these ideas. What is inclusive participation? Who is included and who is excluded, and who defines this? It keeps coming down to that question. What's the effectiveness of true global governance, a multipolar world? With a stronger emphasis on stewardship becomes very important here. Stewardship of information, of knowledge, of power, of political decision-making, and indeed, stewardship of sovereignty. We all have the right to be on our own terms. Yeah. And then the concept of knowledge co-creation becomes quite important. I'll skip to the point of potential, which refers to then the transformation of cultural and historical moments into opportunities for action. So I think the other evening somebody spoke about people who are in Seattle, people who are part of the World Social Forum. But oftentimes, I think that the era for that kind of mass organizing, it might be at a lull at this moment. I don't think we're going to be in a space where there are 100,000 people who feel and think very similarly to us. I think this kind of gatherings are now as good as it gets, and I think that this is important because it is deeper, it is smaller, and it is less about making noise towards difference rather than thinking and strategizing effectively about what that could do. I'll say a bit here about redistribution based on historic contributions. I think I already mentioned the kind of distributional value that is important to note, particularly non-financial redistribution. So the labor that has been donated to the world by people of the majority world, especially by women of the majority world. What does this look like? The knowledge that has been taken, the skills that have been taken, the children who've been raised by other people while their parents are migrant laborers subsidizing the labor of the minority world. How do you begin to measure that? How do you give back for that? How do you give back for the fact that your life is more comfortable because somebody else has been made uncomfortable? Not just for one generation, oftentimes intergenerationally. What is this brave new world? How will the community of minority world allies make a meaningful contribution in a multipolar geopolitical setting in the 21st century? What are the core values? What are the uniting ideas? Again, this is what I've been hearing in the last few days. What is the big idea? What's the one big thing that brings us together? I don't think it can be one big thing. I think it can be many small things that hold us together. But we need to agree. There needs to be consensus, and there needs to be context to that consensus. So the consensus from Lesotho will not be the same as the consensus in Luxembourg. The logic might be completely different, and that's fine, because solidarity is not the same as being the same. The likelihood of us transitioning to a multipolar world in the near future is not only inevitable, it has begun. It's messy, it's difficult. I use the example of South Africa taking the Israeli state, the illegitimate, I will say Israeli state, to the international courts and showing global leadership in this time. I think 10, 15 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to imagine that a country of the majority world, that people who looked like me could hold people who looked different to me accountable, and that the world would listen and follow. Because as you know, many other countries have now decided to follow suit. So this is a sterling example, a crystal example, a real live action example of what multipolarity is now looking like. I'll say less about sovereignty, but I think that the concept of sovereignty inside the UN system is, of course, subject to a lot of scrutiny. Even the impetus. I mean, I think I am very cynical about a few things. The one is the United Nations, and as part of the Global Governance Compact, I'm cynical about its lack of bias. I'm cynical about its ability to reframe and to shift itself into reflecting multipolarity. We can see this by the way that power moves within this institution. And I think that the other thing is, of course, when we look at the origins of the United Nations, or what used to be called the League of Nations, it was formed at a time when most people in the world were not viewed as fully human by colonizing powers. This is what's in the DNA. And I've always thought that, when I look at the way that a lot of these global governance institutions treat the majority world, they treat us in addendumized ways, because indeed we were not, they were not created in consideration of us. What is the economy? It's relational, it's intergenerational, and it's feminist. And this is, I would strongly suggest that agency is a key factor, and I'd also suggest that we have to think around what it looks like when we think about an economy that is rooted in a decolonial construct. That is thinking around and rethinking traditional metrics as well, that move away from throwing fish at people who have never asked for fish. And because I'm now no longer getting the look, there's a man coming at me, I will leave it at that, but this is going to be made available. But I think that we can use this to really have an important and exciting conversation, and there's my conclusion. There are no easy conclusions. Thank you so much. Yeah. I'll go and sit.
Stay with me. That's not the end. Thank you very much for this storm of sparkling ideas and sharp analytical thoughts. We want more of it. And we still have 10 minutes for some questions or maybe even comments. And you're warmly invited to continue sharing your insights and wisdom. And I go directly into the audience. I can see you, at least.
Hello.
So here's the first.
Thank you for installing the new verbs, the majority world and the minority world. I like it. You're doing a great job in convincing the minority world that something should change. But from the viewpoint of the majority world, they are still looking at the minority as where they want to be. Does the same story work to convince them that they should not try to be there, what they are seeing, what could be better for the other story?
Sure. Shall I answer one by one?
I think so. They are not. Yes,
okay,
please.
that's perfect. So I think, this whole idea of aspiration, you raise an important, the aspirationality of the majority wanting to be part of the minority. And that's complex because that could be economically, that could be culturally, but also it's complicated because of globalization and what I call the McDonaldization of the world. It's actually quite difficult to sometimes distinguish between regions. Young people across the world, they look literally the same to me. They look almost identical, listening to the same music, drinking the same wretched Starbucks stuff, and really almost deculturalized, which is also very insidious. But I think, again, it goes back to historical trajectory. Colonialism and coloniality, which of course is the ongoing presence of colonial imprints, is a thing that both the majority and the minority world have to deal with. If one has been told long enough, for hundreds of years, that what you have is nothing, and that what you do have has been taken and is hiding inside European museums, hiding inside European textbooks, and in a really visceral way, hiding inside European museums like Sarah Bachman from South Africa, it takes a lot to undo. But I think the media plays a role in that. I think that there are alternative and multiple ways of re-educating, diseducating, and dismantling that. And it's happening. There are many people, I think, I'm part of a larger community of scholars, of activist scholars who are, who we take our inspiration from some of our elders, our elder scholar activists as well. Can start with Samir Amin and many others like that, Amina Mama, Patricia McFadden, etc., etc. So I think that kind of movement building also helps to shift that cognitive coloniality.
Thanks for that. Next one is...
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very inspirational. I would like to ask you to, if you're possible, to elaborate a bit on the idea of cultural appropriation, which has also been happening from in which the minority world has appropriated a lot of elements from the majority world, especially also there's a sort of rise, of course, in elements like, for example, indigenous economics and all those type of concepts. So how would one, without applying the same form of appropriation, how would one do that in a, lack of a better word, respectful way, or decent way?
I hear you. Decent is a good word, actually. Decent works, because I think decent also suggests, it does suggest respect. It suggests an equal playing field, right? When we play nicely, we play decently, we observe certain mores, certain, I don't want to say rules, but certain norms, agreed upon norms, and that needs agreement. You need to be in agreement in order to arrive at those norms, and in order to be in agreement, you need to be in dialogue, you need to be in communication, and you need to be in community. And I think as well, when we speak about appropriation, it's on multiple levels, isn't it? I mean, it's the one crass, obvious example is everything that looks familiar to me hiding in European and US museums. That's one part of it. And that might seem quite minor, but cognitively, to be told for generations that this is your stuff, but we're going to hold on to it because you just don't know how to look after it, has its own toxicity, doesn't it? When we translate that then into knowledge systems which are taken and then not even recognized and acknowledged. So I think as well there's a bit to be said about intellectual property. I think that in a previous draft of this, I actually talked about intellectual property and trying to build in different ways of recognizing knowledge, because certainly the majority world barely gets recognition for its knowledge. And I think that when you speak about indigeneity as well, the temptation is always to place the black and brown world in this time capsule. So, we are these exoticized, fetishized, sitting under a tree, doing exotic things, right? This is clearly not true. This is just not like every other cultural group. Our sciences are evolving, our cosmologies are evolving. We have many cosmologies. It's even very problematic to say stuff like African knowledge, 54 countries, and then within those countries, several different people groups, far more diverse than Europe, than the US as well. So I think that there's the need to then think around co-optation that is both tangible and intangible, and also the co-optation that has already taken place. I mean, the physical co-optation of spaces, of land, and so on, but also the co-optation of languages, of foods, and again, this is something that we don't talk about, of music. Recognition is so very important, but intellectual property and decolonized intellectual property plays a very important role in that, as well as the academy. What are we teaching? What are we learning? What are we imbibing? I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yep.
Next one is over there.
Yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Thank you for your very inspiring keynote. I think you mentioned a lot about things that don't work.
Yeah.
And you, of course, came to the conclusion that there are no easy conclusions.
Yeah.
But I would still like to, as an engineer, be interested in knowing what is one possible solution, because there are infinitely many solutions that don't work. So it's more useful, at least from my perspective, to know what could be a new world order that you think is just and fair and representative, etc.
So we've already had a few experiments on the African continent. The Lagos Plan of Action, for example, which was, as the name says, came out of the Lagos School of Economics in the late 70s as well, and that was a constellation of different scholars, including my big brother Adebayo Olukoshi, who's a good mentor friend of mine, who were thinking through different ways of what industrialization meant at the time. And this came at a time when, of course, there were different schools of thought. Should Africa industrialize or deindustrialize? They were thinking around breaking value chain appreciation, trying to de-link and de-center our production models from the majority world to the minority world, thinking around how to value processing and so on, and also thinking around de-fetishizing indigenous knowledge for some of the reasons that I have mentioned. That was scarpered significantly and specifically by structural adjustment. And unfortunately, every other paragraph of many of the work of my generation of scholars will say something about structural adjustment, because unfortunately, the past is still with us. I mean, of more recent, there was NEPAD under President Mbeki, which was basically a new partnership for development, for African development. I mean, at the time, a lot of us critiqued it, and I still do, as being very neoliberal. It was funded from abroad and so on. But my thing with them, I think there's a bit where I said alternatives that are not really alternative. My thing is that even if it's not perfect, you need something to move out of the train platform. And I think that's the other thing that sometimes, as the, whether we're calling ourselves progressive, leftist, whatever, that we sometimes wait for the perfect thing, the perfect model. And I think we sometimes become so immobilized because there is no perfect thing and perfect model. We won't know if it works until we do something. We don't know how fast the car will go until you drive it. So there have been, actually, previously, at least in terms of the economy, there have been many. I think that as well the Banque de Sur, which late President Chavez was hoping would be devolve away from the World Bank prescripts as well. At the moment, you're probably aware, the BRICS Development Bank, again, very neoliberal, but what it does offer, it does offer better interest rates than the World Bank. It offers less punishing, slightly more forgiving loan repayments. I mean, this is where we are. We're looking at the worst of the best, or the best of the worst, depending which way you look at it. But there are alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Just let me add the last aspect on this. You talked already about the new international economic order. Do you envision somewhere a germ of a second attempt of such a new international economic order? Or could you imagine what could today be the first step into such an endeavor?
Interesting. It's happened. It's happened before, and it's kind of happening again, but not on a really wide scale. So, as I mentioned, it very much came out of the Bandung Project. There were leaders like Michael Manley in Jamaica. There were people like Kenneth Kaunda who were looking at these sorts of ideas. But that's a long time ago. The 70s are a long time ago, and what has happened since then, of course, is that so much, the structural adjustment has happened. Globalization has happened. World Bank prescripts have happened. The war on terror has happened. The America's war terrorizing the rest of us, as I see it, has happened. And this has actually meant that cognitively, financially, the space for imagining and reimagining has shrunk incredibly. So I would still say that, spaces and places in a very limited way, like the BRICS, like the African Development Bank, which is also very neoliberal, like the ASEAN Bank, which is also very liberal, like Mercosur. I see regionalism as a way of doing things differently because at least there's the autonomy and the space to potentially experiment at regional level. So be in community, because I just think being silos is dangerous. It's politically dangerous, difficult. I don't know why the UK decided to sail off onto their own boat, but I think that it's also really a way of aggregating our power, because there is, and our resources. So perhaps that's not a new international economic order, but the germ of possibility might exist in some of those spaces.
Let's cultivate these germs together.
Yes, let's do that.
Thank you very much for sharing all your wisdom and insights with us.
Thank you.
For being with us through these 3 days. Your taxi is waiting downstairs, but you still can stay 5 minutes with us if you wish so.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you for all your contributions and have a safe travel back.
Thank you.
We will continue the discussion. Thank you, Lebohang.